To begin, we have a piece of metal that measures 1 foot 2.5 inches by 10 3/4 inches. I'm going to start out by laying out my number 1 operational line by creating some reference points that are 1/2 inch away from the edge of my object. This will be a dashed line that runs almost the entire way across our sheet metal. Next, I'm going to lay out my number 2 operational line. Again, that is 1/2 inch from the edge of our sheet metal. These will also run almost the entire way across our workpiece. Next, I'm going to identify the corners, which will be cut out. It will be 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch. This will be an object line. After that, I'm going to identify my number 3 operational line, which is 2 5/8 inches from the bottom of my object. This will be a dashed line. I'm then going to measure up 7 5/8 inches, which will give me my number 4 operational line. And I get this by adding the distance from the edge of my object to my number 3 line, plus the distance between my number 3 line and number 4 line. After that, we need to lay out our notches, which are located 1/2 inch on either side of our number 3 and number 4 operational line. After my lines have been laid out, I'm going to identify my sequence of operation lines. After having laid out the toolbox base, I'm going to be using aviation shears and cutting out each of the 6 notch locations. Taking a look at the operational procedures, our first fold will be a single hem. This will be on our number 1 identified line. Using the box and pan brake, we will be placing the number 1 operational line in line with the edge of the finger blocks. When completed, you should have a single hem. Next, we will be doing our number 2 operational line. This will be bent to a 90-degree angle. And we will do the same procedure for the other end. After that, we're going to do our number 3 procedural line. And again, we're going to line up our line with the edges of our finger blocks. And this will go at 90 degrees also. And then that will be followed by our number 4 procedural line. This one will also be bent at 90 degrees. At this point, the base of our toolbox has been made. You want to start by double checking that your sheet metal is 5 inches wide by 4 inches tall. This is the size of each of our 2 ends. I'm going to begin by laying out my first reference point, which is 1 5/8 inches from each edge of our part. I'm then going to lay out 2 5/8 inches from the bottom as another reference point. And connect those together. My 1/8 inch chamfer will be laid out next. After laying out our toolbox ends, we will be using the squaring shear to cut each of the corners to our identified marks. It is important to line up our marks very carefully and very accurately. After our corners have been cut, we want to fit our ends into the base to see if we need further adjustments. If we take a close look at our end with it being installed, we can see that the left side is tight up against the left side of our toolbox. However, the right side, we are touching at the bottom, but we have pushed out the side of our toolbox at the top. This is an indication that our side pieces are slightly too wide to fit in here comfortably. So it is forcing that right side of our toolbox further away. We need to correct this issue before we continue. To correct this, I'm going to be creating a mark about a 1/16 of an inch on the edge of my side. I'm then going to use the squaring shear and shear off that 1/16 of an inch of material. And I'm again going to test fit that. This time it slid easily in place and did not push out the sides of my toolbox. And lastly, we're going to use a metal file to take off any burrs on the edge of the metal. After sizing our toolbox ends so they fit comfortably within our toolbox base, we will be spot welding the toolbox ends in place. We're going to use a series of spot welds, 2 along the shorter sides and 3 along the longer side at the base. However, prior to spot welding, we need to double check a couple things. First off, we need to make sure that when the end is installed, the sides of our toolbox are perpendicular to the base. We want a 90-degree angle in each corner. If this is not the case with your toolbox, you will need to adjust either the sides or the ends. Additionally, if your sides are bowing out, do not spot weld it. We need to make sure that the toolbox ends are tight with the sides of the base. Towards the back of my toolbox, the side is not all the way tight up against the end. Prior to spot welding, I need to make sure that this is held in place tight against the end piece, otherwise it will throw my measurement off for the opening of my toolbox. Prior to spot welding, I'm going to install a clamp to help hold my sheet metal in place so it won't move on me. And again, I'm double checking to make sure that the toolbox end is tight up against the side of my toolbox base. Using the spot welder, we want to make sure that the spot welder will not come in contact with the clamp, but it will be positioned correctly to give us a good spot weld. After the first spot weld, we're going to reposition the clamp. But again, if a side needs to be pushed in, make sure that is done. On my second side, I can see that the toolbox end is tight up against the toolbox side. I'm ready to spot weld. So far, I have only done 2 spot welds, 1 on each of the sides, double checking in between spot welds to make sure that everything is lined up correctly. At this point, I should not need the clamp anymore, and I should be able to hold it in place and do the remaining spot welds. My first end is now installed, and I can repeat the same procedure with the other end. You want to verify that you are beginning with a piece of metal that is 14.5 inches wide by 6.5 inches tall. I'm going to start by laying out my number 1 operational line, which is located a 1/2 inch away from the edge of my object. This will be a dashed line and will run almost the entire height of our object. It will be on both sides. My number 3 operational line will be a 1/2 inch down from the top. Taking a look at my number 2 operational line located furthest towards the bottom of my drawing, I'm going to identify that line, which is 2.125 inches from the bottom. My other number 2 operational line is 3.875 inches from the bottom. The lowest notch is 6.25 inches up from the bottom. Next, we need to identify 3/16 of an inch on either side of my number 2 operational lines. And then our last point of reference is 1 1/8 inches from the top of our part. This is adding together a 1/2 inch for our upper tab and 0.625 inches as our reference measurement. Next, we need to locate our handle mount holes. To do that, I am going to create a center reference line. And base my measurement off of that center reference line. It will be 2.875 inches on either side. I then need to create a horizontal center reference line. And from here I can go a 1/2 inch on either side of that center reference line. After that, we have our latch holes. So I'm going to extend that center reference line up and base my .625 measurement off of that center reference line. After our ends have been installed, we are going to create the top so that it is contoured to those ends. We're going to start by cutting out all of our notched portions with aviation snips. There will be 8 pieces total. And once those small pieces have been removed, we are ready to move forward with our order of operation for folding this. On the box and pan brake, we're going to begin by lining up our procedural line number 1 with the finger blocks. This will come up to a 90-degree angle. On both ends. Next, we will be bending our first number 2 procedural order line. This will be bent a slight amount. It will be under 90 degrees because we are trying to contour this to the end of our toolbox. A good indication to tell you if you are getting close to the proper angle is to take a look at the little V notch that you cut out. When each leg of the V come together, that is a close measurement for what we need this to be at. We're then going to set the cover on our toolbox and see if we are getting close to that desired angle. With this edge tight against the end, I'm still going uphill just a little bit. So I'm going to try to bend that a tad bit more, and then I'll move on to the next one. We will be able to adjust this a little bit by hand once it is folded up. After that, I'm going to flip the top around, insert it back into the box and pan brake on my other number 2 line, and fold this up at that same angle. And once again, we can double check our contour. Now there should be a small gap along the back edge of your project, and there should be a small lip along the front edge of your project. The gap along the back edge will accommodate the hinge that we will install at a later time, and the small overhang on the front edge of your project will be folded down somewhat to accommodate the latch mechanism. This will also help seal your toolbox shut. The next step is to bend the overhang on the front, and that is our last procedural order of operation line. This needs to come down so it is perpendicular to the base of the toolbox, it should be parallel to the sides of the toolbox. It will not be at a 90-degree angle to our top, but it will be a 90-degree angle to our cut mark. So we will line up that third and final operation line. And bend that into position. And another quick test. And I think we're looking pretty good. Our toolbox will have a hinge running the entire length for connecting the cover to the base and allowing us to open and close it. The hinge consists of 2 pieces of metal with fingers and a pin running through the fingers. If we take a look at the back of the hinge, you can see what almost appears to be a line going down the length of the hinge at the base of each of the fingers. Each of these lines will be our reference lines for installing the hinge on our project. It is very important to recognize and identify these reference lines prior to installing it on your project. The distance between these lines will be the reveal of our hinge on the back portion of our project. The hinge will be installed along the back edge of our project. This is the edge that is opposite of that single hem that we put on the base. The single hem side is the front of our project. We want to focus on the back edge. The hinge will also be going on the inside of our project, not the outside. To lay out the hinge, again, I'm going to be basing my hinge location off of that reference line at the base of the fingers of each of those pieces of the hinge. If your hinge is sticking too far forward, you're going to run into problems with your toolbox not closing properly. If you put the hinge too far back, your toolbox isn't going to be able to open or close because it cannot pivot on that hinge pin. With the hinge positioned correctly, I'm going to be placing 2 clamps along the length of the hinge to help hold it in place. I'm then going to double check and verify that that reference line is running along the edge of the back of my toolbox. If everything looks good and everything is lined up perfectly, I'm going to spot weld the hinge in 2 spots, 1 on each end of the toolbox. And this may require 2 people to help hold it in place. After spot welding, you can remove the clamps. And spot weld it in 3 additional locations. After spot welding, you will want to let the hinge cool for a few minutes before attempting to set up the cover for installation. After our spot welds have cooled, we are ready to set up for installation of the cover. When laying this out, we want the same amount of reveal on the hinge that we had when we installed it on the base. Additionally, you want to make sure that when it is closed, the cover fully is seated on the toolbox. You don't want to spot weld it clear over here. That cover needs to be centered around the toolbox. Following similar procedures as the base, we're going to clamp that in place. Ensuring that our hinge is lined up with the same amount of reveal. Now, before continuing, double check to make sure that the cover is centered on the base. Looking at the right side of my toolbox, I can see that my base is sitting slightly to the left of my cover, which could be okay because we want those little tabs to close around the outside of the base. However, when looking at the left side of my toolbox, I can clearly see that the left end of the toolbox is sitting outside of the cover where it's going to close. This lid is going to close and there will be a gap on the left side of my toolbox. I need to adjust the cover and split the difference between these so that there will not be a gap in that toolbox cover. It will close on top of and on the outside of both of those end pieces. After that, we want to double check the reveal of our hinge in relation to our cover. My cover on this end of my toolbox is sitting just a little bit too far away from the hinge. I can tell that because the pin of the hinge is a pretty far distance from the edge of my cover. I need to take the edge of my cover and slide it inward toward the hinge pin. After laying out everything perfectly and double checking and triple checking the spacing of the hinge and the cover, and that the cover will close and it will go around the toolbox, I'm ready to spot weld my hinge following the same procedures. 2 spot welds on the ends, remove the clamps, 3 additional spot welds down the length. And after that, we can check to make sure that everything looks good. We will be using pop rivets to install the corners onto our project. Taking a look at the corner, we're going to set the first one in place. And we're going to use a marker, and we're going to mark the hole locations. We're going to position the toolbox so we are always drilling down. This is a 2-person job. One person will need to secure one end of the toolbox away from where the other person is drilling. The other person will be drilling with 2 hands on the drill. Because remember, if you have 2 hands on the drill, you can't drill through your hand. Drilling slowly with a light amount of pressure, we're going to drill each of these holes. Then we're going to rotate the toolbox again so we are always drilling down. And continue with the same procedure until all of the holes are drilled. After all of the holes are drilled, we can use a pop riveting gun to install our pop rivets. Make sure you are maintaining firm downward pressure so that pop rivet will be tight up against the project. If you have a corner that does not sit very flat, it wobbles around, perhaps because we have a real sharp point here, you can take a metal file and slowly bring down that corner. Now that corner sits tightly on there. We have previously laid out the handle, which actually ends up being on the inside of our toolbox. We're going to lay that out again, but on the outside. However, this time when we lay it out, we cannot use that 7 1/4 inch measurement to find our center point because we've already folded down the end 1/2 inch. So if we take 7 1/4 minus a 1/2 inch, that will give us 6 3/4. That is the measurement that we need to find our center point. Before drilling my holes, I'm going to lay out my handle pieces just to make sure that everything is lined up correctly and that it looks like it's centered and it looks like everything's going to work. If you do notice a problem, now is the time to fix it. After that, we can drill our holes. Again, this is a 2-person job. One person needs to be holding the toolbox securely away from the drilling location, and the other person needs to be drilling with 2 hands on the drill at a slow pace with light pressure. Now, if you install both of the ends, the handle will not fit in. You won't be able to get the handle in there. So we need to install one end, place the handle in position, and then install the other end. And this will also be done with pop rivets. The latching mechanism is composed of 2 different pieces. We have a catch and we have the actual latch. The catch is designed so the latch will hook around it and catch onto the lip. This is important because we need to install this in the right orientation on our toolbox. We need to make sure that the hook end is facing up so that latch will hook on. Inside our toolbox, we have actually already laid out the hole locations for our catch. Using a hole punch, we will create the holes that will take the pop rivets. And a couple pop rivets will help us secure that. But make sure that you are installing it with the hook end up. To lay out the bottom portion of our latching mechanism, we're going to hook that onto our top portion. And if we depress the top, we can see that the top has some give. That give will affect the location that our bottom portion of our locking mechanism will be positioned at. We want to maintain downward pressure, and with that downward pressure, we're going to mark our hole location. This is typically located less than a ½ inch from the bottom of our toolbox. Using that bottom hole location, I can identify my top hole location. And we can drill those holes. And use a couple pop rivets to install that in place. After that, we can test its functionality.